So awesome. So welcome. It's great to see folks. We are presenting this public event of the Richmond Racial Equity Group. And we're just thrilled that folks could make it out tonight. And my name's Denise Noble, and I began my journey with Richmond Racial Equity last summer. And RRE, short term for Richmond Racial Equity, is a super dedicated group of local folks who are committed to racial justice in our greater community. And the group was formed last June. Time sure does fly. And we have been meeting weekly since then, and we continue to meet every week, Tuesday nights from 7 until 8:30. And meetings are totally open to anyone who wants to join us. And every week the links are posted. They're posted on our website, which is richmondracialequity.org. They also get posted in Front Porch Forum. So please join us if you have an interest. It's a great group of people. I am so thrilled to be a part of this. And so the purpose for tonight's event is to share public information about what our Richmond Police Department does and what some of the community's perceptions about public safety in Richmond are. So with us tonight is Hunter Wasser. I know him just a little bit since he is my firstborn. And Hunter is currently a junior at Skidmore College in Saratoga, New York. And he did this really great summer project, got a grant from a Skidmore funding summer experience fund. And he looked at police activity reports and surveyed Richmond residents on their knowledge and thoughts about police activities and public safety. Hard to believe the summer went by that fast. So Hunter is going to present his results of this summer project. And then afterwards, we'll do a short Q&A, probably have about 10 minutes. If by chance we have too many questions that can't be answered in our time, we can have people post them in the chat and get back to folks or post them on our website. So after the Q&A, then we would love to invite all of you to participate actively in breakout rooms to find out what else y'all would like to learn about our police department and our public health and safety services. So in those breakout rooms, we will ask folks to share what, if anything, surprises you about the information that Hunter's presenting tonight, what questions you may have, and ideally what you'd like to learn more about. So again, the breakout rooms are not recorded, and we are super interested in folks' honest and open reflections. This is a huge value to Richmond Racial Equity as well as our community. And one last reminder, as we know these Zoom meetings go, please remember to keep yourselves on mute. So Hunter, take it away.
All right, thank you. And thank you again to everyone for coming, and to Richmond Racial Equity, everyone for helping me and supporting me with this work over the summer. Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and we are gonna get started. So for those of you who don't know or haven't been following this project over the summer, it's called the 2021 Richmond Public Safety Project. That's how I'll refer to it in the presentation by me. So first, I just want to give a brief overview about what I'm going to talk about in the next 20 or 25 minutes. First is just a pretty quick overview about what the goals of this project were and are. Second will be the review of the Richmond Police Department activity data. That's looking at their activity logs. Third will be a walkthrough of the survey responses, which were collected in July and August of this summer. And we're going to end finally with a summary just of the overall points of this presentation and what we want people to take away from it. So, project goals. There are basically 4 points to this research. And the first is just to investigate the actual role of the Richmond Police Department. So sort of answering the question, what do our police do? Because for many people, that's not a question that you could answer with specific details. And we're going to be looking at activity data from 2013 through 2019 that's been publicly available on the town website, but just, activity data in PDFs is not super easy to look at and understand. So the research that I've done is aggregating that all and providing some summary statistics about it. Secondly, the research is gauging the Richmond community's awareness about the Richmond Police Department's activity. So we're looking at the survey responses and comparing them to the activity data and seeing how accurate are people's beliefs about the Richmond Police Department. Third, we're asking the Richmond community what role they want to see the Richmond Police Department play in our community. And to answer that question, we'll look at survey responses. And then finally, we'll be looking at survey responses to understand what changes, if any, people living in Richmond or the surrounding area would like to see about our police department in the future. So to start, again, I'm going to go through an overview of the Richmond Police Department's activity from 2013 to 2019. So this data comes from police reports from those years, and the reports track law incidents, which are essentially times when the police responded to a situation, and they're split into incidents and traffic stops. And I've analyzed them separately due to the fact that they're split on these reports. And each incident or traffic stop is assigned to one category in my analysis and one category only, so there's no double counting. Now, these reports also include write-ups about certain incidents. However, not every incident also has a corresponding write-up. So there might be a potential selection bias about which incidents get write-ups and which incidents don't. So they haven't been included in my analysis just because of that uncertainty. And the fact that many of them are just missing. However, in the grand scheme of the research, there is some missing data as well. There are 149 two-week periods from the start of these reports in 2019 to their end in 2019. However, there are only 114 biweekly reports that were publicly available. So that's just something to acknowledge moving forward, that this data, while it is a majority of that time period, is not the complete picture. So this is just a quick sample of what a report might look like. This is one from 2015 in October. And on the top, you can see traffic tickets, see the categorization. And then on the bottom, you can see the incidents, and those are also categorized. And my work is essentially to take 100 about of these reports, aggregate all of these data, and present them. And that's what we will see shortly. So first, one of the biggest takeaways from looking at all this activity data as one body is that over half, 51.28% of RPD incidents fell into the two largest categories, which were nonviolent disputes or violations and information or assistance. So for an overview of these data, you can see again, the majority of the work is in those top two nonviolent categories of people having, an argument that might need to be resolved by an outside party, say the police department, or they're just calling looking for information about something in the town or looking for assistance with something on their property, perhaps. 20% of the Richmond Police Department's work comes in assisting other police departments or other agencies, and that's agency assists on the right. And that could be police departments in the area, the Vermont State Police, Richmond Rescue. There's a whole host of things that agency assist could be, but it's a very varied category. Similarly, there's 8% of incidents which are not easy to be categorized, things like dead body, for example, that don't fit nicely into another category. And it's just important to acknowledge that, yes, there is a chunk of our data that's falling in that other category that isn't represented in the main categories that we're looking at. And one other thing I'd like to point out about these data is that the category that you can see, race, ethnicity, faith, gender, or sexual orientation-based harassment, shows a 0% incidence. And I just want to make clear that that is because these types of identity-based harassment aren't explicitly tracked in those activity reports. So while there might be an intimidation complaint that shows up in an activity report, there's no way to tell whether that intimidation complaint is maybe coming from someone who is being intimidated in a racially charged way. But since the reports don't explicitly state that, we have to approach this issue with a no data type of lens. So that's basically to say that we're uncertain about what the incidence of identity-based harassment is based on police reports. So when we look at traffic stops, again, these are broken down into fewer categories. Moving violations, where the stop in question was prompted by a vehicle doing something illegal by the way it was moving, so speeding, for example, and non-moving violations, which relate to, say, having outdated registration or a tail light out and you get pulled over. And again, there's another category. But the clear picture here is that most stops are for moving violations, and most moving violations, in fact, the overwhelming majority, 76.48% of moving violations are for speeding. And when you total that up, speeding accounts for almost half of all traffic stops in Richmond. So moving on to the survey, there were responses that were collected over July and August 2021, last summer. And the sampling method that was used is convenience sample, basically disseminating the survey via intranet, word of mouth. And of course, that means that we're not working with the same type of statistical validity that a random phone sample would have. In a town of 4,000 people, where your ideal body of responses might be, say, 400 people, the resources needed to conduct a random phone survey just were not feasible for something of this size. So going forward, it's just, I'll be talking about survey respondents said this, not the Richmond community thinks this, because again, we can't generalize with certainty these responses to the Richmond community at large. However, they do give us a picture about what some people are thinking. There were overall 564 responses. 290 of them are usable. A large part of that comes from people who clicked the survey link and then didn't fill anything out, or entered their zip code and then didn't fill anything out. The survey software that I used, Qualtrics, automatically submits those responses after a couple of weeks of inactivity. So that's where most of those unusable responses come from. And then there were some that came from non-stakeholders, so people who didn't live in Richmond or work in Richmond or spend time in Richmond at regularly scheduled events. And that's mainly just because we want to understand what our community thinks about its police department, to get a pulse on those ideas locally, rather than having opinions from people from around the state, say. And the survey is going to be broken into 3 parts, like I talked about before. We're going to be looking at respondents' awareness of what the police department does, what their priorities are for how they think the police department should act, and their visions for what they'd like to see the police department do in the future. So first, because I mentioned how this survey is not a random sample, I just wanted to give some basic demography about our respondents. As you can see on the left, the respondents in our survey skewed older than the residents of Richmond. 94% of our respondents are residents. So I'm going to compare the respondent demographics to the demographics of people living in Richmond as a pretty close proxy. Again, people in the survey tended to be older than the average person in Richmond, and they also skewed more female than people living in Richmond. And of course, the census data that I was using does not track whether census respondents are cisgender or transgender, so we don't have data on that from the census. It's another source of a lack of data. Same thing with respondents who would identify as non-binary. So then when we come to race and ethnicity, the first chart is all races and ethnicities, and the second one is non-white races and ethnicities, just so that we can get kind of a clearer picture, because it's no secret, Richmond is an overwhelmingly white community. And as you can see, white people are actually slightly underrepresented in this survey. And then on the bottom chart, you can see how various other racial and ethnic groups compare in their representation in this survey versus in the community. And then interestingly enough, when we look at the ideology of respondents as liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans, we see that it's actually a very close match to people in Richmond. And this data is based on voting in past elections. So for a survey about police activity, there's actually a surprisingly representative body of survey respondents based on ideology, which is nice to see. Again, the survey doesn't have, statistical validity that allows us to calculate p-values and confidence intervals and make assumptions about the Richmond community at large. But we can see that in some cases, the survey is representative. And again, here's just a summary. Women, people 35 and older, and the Latinx and Hispanic communities were overrepresented. Men, people younger than 35, Asians, Black people, and Pacific Islanders were underrepresented. And then Indigenous people, white people, liberal and Democrats, and conservative Republicans were approximately represented in this survey. So for the first section of the survey, we're thinking about awareness. What do respondents believe about our police department, and is it correct? So they were presented with the opportunity to guess about what proportion of Richmond Police Department incidents involved the categories that I tracked in my research. And this is what that looked like. They were given a multiple choice question. And so when I went to analyze these, I'll have a chart that will summarize across all categories, but I just wanted to explain how to interpret it first. So on the bottom of the chart, you'll see the category that's being looked at in a specific set of bars. And then you'll see each bar represents an answer on the survey. So for example, in the violence against other people question, the most common answer was 0 to 10%. That's also the correct answer, because the actual percentage of incidents that involve violence against other people was 0.91%. So you see the correct answer is shaded in green. And in this case, that's also the most popular answer. And as the certain answers get further away from the most correct answer, so 50% plus, they get shaded a darker shade of red. So then if you look on the right side, for example, for information or assistance, the most popular answer was 11 to 20%. However, the correct answer was 21 to 30%, because the actual proportion of incidents involving people seeking information or assistance was 21.84%. So that's how to interpret these graphs. So now we can see all of the categories. And the first takeaway is that most of the time, respondents don't know how the Richmond Police Department is spending their time. In almost every case, the right answer is not the most popular answer. And this has the exception of moving traffic violations, violence against other people, and theft, fraud, and property issues. In those cases, the most popular answer was also the correct answer. However, if we think about the majority of respondents, there was only one time that the majority of respondents answered correctly, and that was violence against other people. In every other case, more people guessed incorrectly than they did correctly. Now, this may be due to the fact that people overestimated more severe issues and underestimated less severe issues in terms of how prevalent they were in our community. And that's something we'll circle back to when we think about respondents and how they answered about their priorities. And of course, you can see the harassment category shaded in blue, because we don't really know what the correct answer is, because we don't have data on how frequently the police department responds to these type of issues. So we can't say whether some respondents were more or less correct in their guesses, but we can see what they guessed. And most respondents thought that it was a pretty fairly infrequent occurrence. So moving on to the second section of the survey, priorities. respondents were given the chance to rank all 10 categories by order of which they thought were most important to address in Richmond. And what we have here is those categories. On the left, you'll see the priority score, which is based on how often people rank those issues high on the list. And on the right, you'll see the proportion of responses that were found in the data. So as we look at this graph, it appears that for the most part, priority is somewhat inverse of how often police are responding to something. For example, mental health crises, violence against other people, domestic violence and conflict, things that aren't happening very much or aren't being responded to very much are high on the list of respondents' priorities, whereas people seeking information or assistance and nonviolent disputes or violations are low on the list of respondents' priorities, but are being responded to a lot. And part of this is that, for example, domestic violence simply just might not happen a lot, and therefore the police department isn't going to respond to it. So, and that's the case with a lot of these more severe issues. Again, violence against other people or situations involving it might just not happen a lot in our community, and therefore the police department isn't going to be responding to it a lot. So it's worth noting that while it might seem like the initial takeaway is the police department is doing things that are not what the people want them to do, there is some part of this that's tied to how often things occur in the world. And that's important to note going forward. And then the final part of this survey about visions gave respondents the chances to see their guesses about police activity alongside the actual data, gave them some quick facts about the Richmond Police Department, and then asked them the following open response questions in order to get them to think about what they would like to see different in their community in the future, if anything, because some respondents said they were satisfied. However, of the respondents who answered these questions, again, that's the 290 usable respondents, 161 respondents suggested some sort of change to public safety in Richmond. And that's just over half, 55%, 56, who suggested a specific change to something about policing or public safety or public health in Richmond. And to summarize that, I again have that same statistic, but with the options of no change and people who are unsure or left the question blank in this bar chart here. And again, it becomes obvious that the majority of respondents wanted to see some sort of change to public safety. And of course, though, it's important to acknowledge that nearly 40% of respondents were satisfied. They did not want to see any sort of change. So there is a 15% difference between people who wanted changes and people who didn't. And it's important to realize that difference, realize how large that difference is relative to how many people answered they want change versus they don't want change. So the rest of this section is looking at what types of changes respondents suggested or mentioned that they would like to see in the future. So this first bar chart talks about changes in practices, things that respondents would like to see the Richmond Police Department do differently or start incorporating or stop incorporating in their work. So, for example, the most popular response in this category, and in fact, the most popular theme overall in this open response question about visions, was seeing the Richmond Police Department incorporate social workers or mental health professionals directly into the department, with 51 people all responding that way. And granted, that's a, it's not even half of the total responses, but it is 51 people all saying the same thing. And that is indeed over 30% of suggested changes. And then the other themes that we saw were community policing, downsizing the department, and making organizational partnerships as other popular changes. You can see in the middle chart here how there were some responses looking for the Richmond Police Department to be abolished, some looking for it to be downsized, and some looking for it to be upsized. And this bar chart just compares those three types of responses side by side. And then finally on the right can see changes in focus area. These were responses that wanted the Richmond Police Department to do something different in a more qualitative way. They wanted them to have a different focus, a different approach to policing. And by far the most popular of these types of responses was for the Richmond Police Department to focus on anti-racism and combating other types of bias, injustice, prejudice in our community. And then focusing on drug use came next at 11 responses. And in a seemingly contradictory turn of events, 10 people wanted to see the Richmond Police Department focus more on traffic, whereas 9 people wanted to see them focus less on traffic. So it's a bit of a splitting point in our community, it seems, at least based on this body of respondents. So to recap all of that into a few succinct points. First, when we look at the Richmond Police Department's activity from 2013 to 2019, we see that most incidents, the majority, involve providing information or assistance to citizens or resolving disputes that are nonviolent. Second, we can see that of the people who responded to this survey, awareness levels are low. Most people don't know exactly how the Richmond Police Department is spending their time, what types of things they're responding to. Third, and again, this has a caveat, respondents' priorities don't tend to align with how the Richmond Police Department is responding to incidents in our community. But again, we have to remember that the Richmond Police Department may be responding to less severe issues, which people rank higher on their priority list, simply because those less severe issues happen less in our community. And we could do further research on that to explore whether these issues are happening a lot or not, versus how often the Richmond Police Department is responding to them. And then finally, it's clear that respondents want to see changes. Over half of respondents suggested a type of change to policing and public safety in Richmond. And of course, those suggested changes are many and varied and have many different types of focus, whether it be practices, the absolute size of the department, or its focuses. There are a lot of ideas in this body of respondents about how public safety can be different in the future. And that is another thing that as we, as members of this community, continue to live here, are going to have to think about which of these ideas do we want to consider, or do we want to consider them at all? Because again, this survey is a body of respondents that is not necessarily reflective of the whole community. So while we can't say a majority of people in Richmond want to see changes, we can use this data as a starting point to have a conversation with the town at large about what changes we would like to make, if we want to make them, to public safety in Richmond. But the only way we get to that conversation is by starting to have it. And that is what this research aims to do. And that is my presentation. So thank you very much. And I'll take some questions or comments now. But I think I'll pass it back to Denise.
Thanks, Hunter. It was a fantastic presentation, and I know all of us are super, super grateful for all of your work and this really comprehensive report that you did. So thank you. And I know that this work will be a great resource for us as Richmond Racial Equity, as the community. So thanks again. So if we are going to go ahead and take some questions, I guess the best way to do this is if folks would like to raise their hand, either, I guess you could do it on the raise your hand like in the screen, or you could actually physically, if you're, well, you're not everybody's on a video, but yeah, so raise your hand and I can call on you, I guess. Trying to look through. Does anyone have any questions, I guess is the question.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, I didn't even look in the chat. Okay, that's a good way to do it too. Okay. So, oh, that's maybe not a question for, that's maybe a question for us, but how will Richmond Racial Equity use this information moving forward?
yeah, I mean that if you guys want to jump in here and add some thoughts, definitely feel free. I can say my intentions in doing this research is to, yeah, basically start conversations in the community about public safety and to get a pulse on what the ideas are that are out here among people in Richmond. Of course, in this research, looking at people who responded to the survey, but yeah, getting a sense for what ideas people are thinking about and how informed those ideas are based on awareness. And that's another piece of this that shows up, thinking about how what we could do to increase awareness, because I think in general we want people to have a good awareness about what their what their governmental or public safety institutions are doing for them. Those are pretty broad answers, but if someone from RRE wants to give more specific details, that would be great.
Denise, may I add?
Yeah, go for it.
This is Connie Vanagan. I'm a member of the Richmond Racial Equity Group. And like, as other people are saying in the chat, Hunter, thank you so much. Check out the chat before you go, please. To answer the question, we didn't enter into this project with a defined outcome, like we want to see this happen, or we think that should happen, or something like that. We really wanted to learn more about our police department and also about our community members' perceptions about the police department, just as a starting point. I think Hunter summed it up nicely in saying that this is a way to begin to have community conversations and to think about, is there anything that we need to learn next? Is there anything else that we should try to figure out? Hunter provided us with a tremendous resource to be able to answer a set of questions. And we think of those as the first set of questions that will lead us to others. And we're hoping that the breakout groups, which we hope you stay for, will help us understand what those other questions might be.
So there's another question in the chat. I'm assuming you can see that, Hunter, but I guess I could read it. Can you provide more insight into how the Richmond Police Department collects and reports their incident data? Could be a question for you, I suppose.
Yeah, so in doing this research, I talked with our police chief, Kyle Kapitansky, and to give a brief answer here, basically when a call comes in, it gets assigned one of these labels. For example, if a traffic or if someone calls and says, "Hey, I need help with," or I need some information about X, then that gets coded as, oh, okay, you know, civilian assist would be the specific type. And then I look at all those and I categorize them into broader categories and summarize them. There's perhaps though a question about whether an incident gets categorized a certain way in the initial dispatch or the call, and then it might get, you know, edited or recategorized based on what happens after the fact. And that's certainly something to look into in the future about how that categorization works. And then as far as reporting goes, the activity reports are publicly available on the Richmond Town website, on the police's section, the police department section of the town website, as PDFs that can be accessed and downloaded. And that's exactly what I did. And yes, Kyle is also here, so he can probably provide more insight in a more well-spoken way to that question than I can.
Yeah, so if Kyle or Josh, either of you guys have anything you want to jump in and add, that's fine. If not, that's fine too. No. All right. I don't see any other questions yet. Anybody else have any other questions? Good to go. All right, well, shall we move on to the breakout rooms? So